So, if you hadn't guessed, yeah, the faction is the Ottoman Empire that we're going to be playing, 1850 to 1920. And I think the Ottoman Empire is a great faction to play in any half-decent grand strategy game, especially during this period. I think the last period, the last sort of 70 years of the Ottoman Empire, is a really intriguing period in its history. The Ottoman Empire is a kind of interesting kind of patchwork of sort of inconsistencies and contradictions. I mean, this is in some ways, it's an empire in a deep state of decay and decline during this period, but it's also a period of intense kind of reform and development. And this is, I think, something that kind of characterized the decline of the Ottoman Empire more generally, is long periods of decay and stagnation, punctuated by really intense periods of reforms, especially when we have fairly kind of capable monarchs at the helm that are kind of aware of the fact that the Ottoman Empire has become eclipsed now by rival powers, and they seek to do something about that. Now, even though it's a declining power, and even though it's, you know, the last 70 years of its history in real life anyway, we intend that not to be the case in our game. The Ottoman Empire definitely still has some punches to throw. We have to bear in mind the Ottoman Empire declined from a very high watermark, really, 150 to 200 years prior to this period. The Ottoman Empire, at the height of its sort of imperial apogee, if you like, was as powerful as probably, you know, most other European powers combined. So it was an absolute colossus in its prime. That's obviously no longer the case, and we would struggle now even to go toe-to-toe with Austria or Russia. But it still has some punches to throw. You know, we're not a colonial province of any other power whatsoever. Our security is going to be dependent on cultivating a kind of network of alliances with rival powers. We have a pretty capable monarch at the helm, Sultan Abdul Nasir I. And this is the so-called Tanzimat period. This is the period of the Tanzimat reforms, a period where the Ottoman Empire Abdul Nasir is looking to reform the Ottoman Empire to kind of bring it into line with the European powers, to kind of, I suppose, stop its decline, to try and modernize the empire and make it a kind of, a competitive power, a big power once again, a big player. And he did that with mixed results. In the last analysis, the empire didn't exist, but we can't necessarily measure reforms by the fact that a society doesn't exist anymore. It certainly did provide it with a new lease of life in some respects. All of this stuff is really reflected very well in this kind of game. The Ottoman Empire has a very weak economy, but it's kind of an army first and an empire second. It's an empire that exists. It seems solely to maintain a pretty large but quite sprawling armed forces. One of the features of the Ottoman Empire is that we're always going to be an empire, and its organization is going to be unstable, anarchic. It's an empire that's going to be sort of permeated by kind of localized revolts and rebellions, some of them quite minor and easy to stamp out, some of them more substantial. And this is going to happen throughout this period, and there's not much we can do about that. This is just a part of the legacy of what we're inheriting, and we have to live with it. I like that about this game. I like the fact that, you know, you can't completely transform something into something that it wasn't and could never have been, really. There's some things that we can do. The Ottoman Empire, along with China during this period, has a lot of kind of off-map guild-based production of things. It has a kind of fairly burgeoning sort of early modern economy, and this is reflected. So, for example, things like manufacturing goods, crafts production is set at 4 at the moment, so we're going to be basically meeting demand for manufactured goods, which is quite interesting. This is not reflected in any manufactories on the map, and we should bear in mind that this kind of level of production, whilst it meets some domestic consumption, this production is Lilliputian compared to what capitalist production will provide us. We have private finance, private capital up here, and what we look to do is to try and build on the early modern guild-based economy that we have, to try and begin to provide or create a powerful capitalist class in the Ottoman Empire, provide it with a constant flow and source of liquidity, so that when the means allow, when we actually are able to do so, let's have a look at what sciences we have developed at this stage. I don't think at this stage we can even build modern industrial manufactories. We won't be able to, possibly for the first few years, maybe the first 5 years. Technology in this game, it's not like other games where you have sliders that you can kind of manually manipulate. The reality of technology is that it just spreads and you can't control it very much. You can invest state revenue into trying to accelerate technology. It's a very inefficient way of doing it. And in any case, anything that you develop before anyone else, they're going to get it within a year or 2 years. So you're never going to have any kind of profound edge over anyone for too long. The Ottoman Empire is going to remain technologically backward when compared to other powers. Russia will also have this in terms of European powers anyway, but Russia is one of the few powers that does go through a little bit of a qualitative change late game. So we're talking in real time, a couple of years from now, possibly a year and a half. In the late 19th or the first decade of the 20th century, Russian technology sliders move to kind of standard. It begins to kind of, at least in terms of its theoretical development, it begins to kind of be at pace with most other European powers. The only other power, of course, that undergoes a profound qualitative change during this period is Japan, which does form into something almost unrecognizable from what it is now. This is not on the cards for the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire certainly can do some ahistorical things, and we intend to do that. The Ottoman Empire must develop, and this is a question, this is a matter of some urgency. We must develop a serious burgeoning industrial base. This is something that will take some time to do. We don't have the means even to do it now, but we need to develop a modern industrial economy. This will affect some things. This will speed up research a little bit. It will provide us with a more educated population if it's kind of highly urbanized, or it can lead to a more kind of educated population. But this is all a long way off. In the early part of the game, our plan is going to be simply to try and expand our agricultural base. We don't have enough private capital that exists. In the accumulated wealth of our capitalists at this moment doesn't allow for the development of any kind of RGOs. RGOs are kind of agricultural enterprises, if you like. What we want to focus on doing is expanding our agricultural base, but also broadening it. We want to provide our population with a broad range of kind of agricultural goods. This is good for population satisfaction. This is something that is very necessary in this game. We want to give them access to cereals, fish, fruits, wine, this kind of thing, but also tobacco. Tobacco is going to be our key cash crop. Tobacco will provide us with a consistent source, not just of decent domestic consumption of this good, but also exports. Tobacco will always export well, particularly to Britain, France, Prussia, countries like this, less so the United States because it has good domestic access to this resource, and in fact will be competing with the United States and foreign markets for exports of tobacco. But tobacco is going to be key in a strange sort of way to our early industrial development, because the export of tobacco is going to provide us with a constant source of liquidity that, when technology allows, for us to begin to develop a bit of an industrial base. Our industrial base is going to focus principally in Western Anatolia, Constantinople, Istanbul, Smyrna, and possibly then we're going to expand into Sinop and Ankara. But also, we're not going to be too shy with Europe. We do intend to keep as many of our European provinces as we can. Thessalonica is also on the cards to be a kind of big industrial city at some point. Much more broadly, our strategy is kind of survival during this entire period. We want to try and really keep as many provinces as we can. We don't want to lose any kind of provinces. We want to sort of defend ourselves. As you can imagine, during this period, our principal opponents, our principal threats are going to come from Russia, Austria, and also possibly France. France has some interest in the Middle East and Lebanon. France during this period is led by Louis Napoleon III. He's a sort of fairly belligerent kind of ruler, and he's certainly interested in kind of engaging in sort of expeditions and this sort of thing. Militarily, we definitely have some punches to throw. Let's bear in mind that, 5-6 years from this date, the Crimean War happens. That is a scripted event, and that will happen. And in the real Crimean War, the Ottoman Empire fairly soundly defeated the Russian army that invaded Rumelia. And when the British and the French landed at Thessalonica, the threat had been largely kind of extinguished to the Ottomans in Europe. And this is what actually resulted in a kind of campaign in the Crimea, that the British and French force re-embarked and then launched a campaign in the Crimea. In real life, the Ottomans fared much more poorly in eastern Anatolia. Along with economic expansion, we do need to expand our armed forces. It is already fairly large, at least in terms of what our economy can support. But we have three fairly understrength armies, really, field armies, comprised of a corps and a couple of divisions each, and supply trains. In this case, we've just got a cavalry division and infantry corps. And I think we also have a field command in eastern Anatolia, These are all kind of understrength forces. They all comprise about approximately, let's have a look. Yeah, so it's about 30,000 men each. This is, these are just 30,000 men, 5,000 horses, 120 cannons. We also have a kind of ad hoc force. Actually, this is a pretty decent sized field command also in Syria, and this is a much more kind of ad hoc, smaller formation. This is a cavalry division with a kind of brigade or a couple of regiments attached. We want to go for some force concentration. The difficulty we have as the Ottomans is that we are going to have periodical revolts in our provinces in the Euphrates and the Tigris, modern day Iraq, Kuwait. We're going to have rebellions, possibly in Palestine and Syria, and certainly our most problematic area for revolts and insurgency is going to be modern day Libya, Cyrenaica, and Tripolitania. This is, I think at this stage, this is not even a properly integrated colonial province. Let's have a look at our colonial ministry of Colonial Affairs. I think this is just an influenced territory that is controlled. It may be a protectorate at this stage. Okay, so it's a protectorate at this stage. Protectorate is a sort of halfway house then, really, between a colony proper and a territory which is kind of merely influenced. So we have some measure of colonial penetration. We're going to have to increase that in this region. That will incur insurgencies and resistance from the local population. The Ottoman Empire has sadly lost the Elayat of Egypt, so we no longer have any kind of contiguous territory linking the rest of our empire to our protectorate in Libya, and this is also the case for Tunisia, which is, coveted by the French. I think the French may already have some. Yeah, we can see that sort of they have some measure of colonial penetration already established there. Quite likely, the Piedmontese or the Italians and the French will squabble over this. To some extent, but I think Tunisia is going to be a lost cause, and we do want to avoid kind of incurring the wrath of any European powers, especially early on. So we're looking at survival, suppressing revolts, economic development, and expanding our armed forces. What we want to ultimately do is to develop 2 fully fledged field commands of armies at kind of maximum strength in terms of the command points we have. I mean, we have quite junior officer corps at the moment. We don't have very many senior officers. Let's have a quick look in Constantinople itself, what officers we have. So we have a Navy transport fleets. Okay, so we have a command also in Constantinople. Yeah, and we have I think the only 3-star sort of full-bird general is Risa Pasha, and he doesn't actually have a command, but he's kind of sitting in Constantinople at the moment. We have lots of kind of Bashi Bazouks, sort of irregular sort of militia paramilitaries, if you like, scattered throughout the empire. Unfortunately, they do eat up resources, but they're quite important during this period, especially during insurgencies. Insurgencies in fairly remote locations can result in, cities which aren't walled, they're not defended or anything like that, very quickly falling, and then a very small insurgency can kind of spiral into something a bit more complex and difficult. So we have to kind of bear that in mind. But we want to kind of, we have to be able to kind of consolidate our interior. That's going to really come with economic development. And one of the issues of economic development is that we don't actually have access to all of the resources that exist in our territory, and in more ways than one. For one, of course, we don't, for example, there are minerals, we don't have any mineral mines here. This is a feature of all economies during this period. It's not just that the resources aren't properly exploited, it's that we can't even access them. So if we look at our collection points, we can see that these red areas have a highly localized economy. The resources in these areas we can't actually access. They're not a part of our national economy. So these areas are so backward, so poorly developed at this stage that we can't even access them. We can develop collection points, and we can kind of deal with that in time, and we certainly will. One of the major kind of obstructions to us developing a really, really large kind of burgeoning industrial economy some years from now is limited indigenous access to coal. We have some in Ankara, some in a name that I definitely can't pronounce, and some in Smyrna. We also, depressingly, have some very near the kind of the border with Bosnia now, and some in Bosnia itself. Bosnia is an area that is coveted by the Austrians, as you can imagine, and at some point they'll take an interest in Bosnia-Herzegovina, and we will have to fight to defend it. Frankly, there's no sort of way around it. And even if we're prepared to give it up, it still will involve a fight, and it's likely that they won't simply occupy it and sort of expect us to do nothing. It's likely they'll conduct a full-scale invasion through the kind of Zvionic sort of kind of corridor. Russian invasions, when they happen, we expect the first 3 to 4, 5 years to be relatively peaceful. We certainly hope that's the case, and we'll send diplomats and we'll try and ensure that is the case. But Russian invasions, as you can appreciate, will likely come down through sort of Silistria and Rumelia, and also in Eastern Anatolia. Eastern Anatolia is not quite as vulnerable as it seems. We have to bear in mind that this area is very poorly developed. It's very mountainous. Russia itself is going to be subject to periodic revolts in the southern Caucasus. This is very much its kind of Wild West. So this is not a really good place for it to base large-scale invasions. It's difficult to supply its forces at this time. Once Russia begins to develop railroads and becomes much more sort of industrialized, then the game really changes very much. At that time, we ourselves will hope to have railroads connecting Constantinople to Kars up here. And we certainly want to look to kind of calcify this area, fortify it. We have depots and this sort of thing, but we want to kind of firm this area up. Very, very generally, we're going to view this in the traditional sense as the rear of our empire. We feel that the threat, I mean, certainly it can be the case that Kars will fall, but it's going to be very difficult for Russia. It'll take them a long time to penetrate deep into the eastern part of the Ottoman Empire. It's very mountainous, very tough terrain, very poorly developed. Persia is no longer really a threat. The question as to kind of the preeminent Middle Eastern power has kind of been settled, really, and it ain't Persia. The days where Persia is a kind of mortal threat to us and a blade in our back, these days are over. I think it's unlikely that Persia is going to constitute any sort of threat to us. So we can sort of be fairly. We don't need any large armies in the Middle East. We do need small, mobile forces that can react to kind of insurgencies and revolts, and they will certainly happen. In the short term, we're going to try and develop a marine division. We're going to try and develop something kind of akin to a mid-19th century rapid reaction force. This is going to serve a couple of purposes. One, it means that we can make landings in Crete, in sort of Cyrenaica or Tripolitania, and also it's much quicker to actually make amphibious landings in sort of Palestine and intervene in our own territory, in the defense of that territory, using a kind of marine force. It will also give some of our more junior commanders, who are fairly capable sort of guys. This is a 2-star general, so he's a sort of lieutenant general. It's going to give them the experience necessary to promote them. And promoting these generals is going to be key to us having large kind of field commands and being able to sort of effectively wield really large armies. And what we want to do is to build 2 very large full-size armies of about 200,000 men apiece. So about 150 to 200,000 men. So we're going to be looking at building an army of about 300,000 to 400,000 men split into 2 commands in Europe, and an army of about 150 to 200,000 men in Eastern Anatolia. These are going to be our main field commands. They're going to be supplemented by a small rapid reaction force, which is going to be based in Smyrna, and then by small irregular forces, Bashi Bazooks, and highly mobile forces dotted around the Middle East. There are possibilities for expansion for the Ottoman Empire, and we intend to pursue those. The Arabian Peninsula is the area where we can expand. It's a natural area of expansion for us. There are questions, there are kind of problems with this. These areas are not very sort of settled. I mean, this is the Hejaz. This is an area that's going to be very difficult. It's going to take time for us to colonize this area. This is also the case with Aden. Now, the other area that is of real interest to us, short term actually, is going to be Dubai and Qatar. The reason for this is because of gems. Now, gems are an interesting commodity. Gems, along with gold, is a commodity with some distinctive features. Once we send merchants to these areas and begin trading with the kind of natives, the locals, we can build trading stations. This will provide us with a constant trickle of this commodity. Now, this commodity will be consumed on the domestic market, much like anything else, okay? But what's left, what isn't consumed, converts into state money, into state revenue. Now, you don't want this to happen to any great extent. The reason being is, particularly early on, we have a very small, very fragile economy. The more this happens, the more this creates inflation. So early on, we just want a small trickle of this stuff just to kind of provide us with a little bit more income. And this will build us a few ships. You know, it will go towards the expenses of the army and some administration costs and this kind of thing. But it's something that over a period of time, it really adds up. And later on, once this area is really heavily consolidated, developed, and colonially consolidated as well, this can be our South Africa. This could be our kind of area for mining. We could really, really exploit and develop this region, and then we have access to a commodity that's very valuable, that can be converted into state revenue, that can be exported as well. at a really, really premium rate. That's something that we're looking at, 20, 30 years from now. This area is untouched. This area is controlled by kind of local local princes, if you like, for the time being. But the Arabian Peninsula, the kind of hinterland, the terra incognita, can be explored, prospected, and exploited. And certainly very late game, sometime from now, of course, with the beginning of the petroleum age, which is really as this game kind of closes. We're sitting on some really, really great kind of real estate, really great territory. In the short term, we're going to just quickly look at our assets balance and make sure everything's zeroed out. We don't want to be importing anything, and the game sometimes, it doesn't seem to be the case here, it sometimes sets to import certain kinds of raw materials. So we're going to go through everything, zero everything out, making sure we're not importing. In some ways, the Ottoman Empire, in terms of really essential kind of raw materials, it's quite self-sufficient. And some manufactured goods, I don't think we're actually importing anything at all, which is kind of good to know. That'll become much clearer next turn in any case. So that's our assets balance. I'm going to have a quick look at our trade balance and what we're kind of... I think first turn, the first fortnight, we're not actually going to export anything. Partly because we want to try and get a clear assessment of how much we're producing, whether we're meeting kind of domestic consumption of certain kinds of goods. So we're not going to kind of we're not going to put anything up for export early on. We have a very small amount of starting private capital. This is the accumulated wealth of our capitalist class. And we need to keep a careful eye on this. And one thing that we need to kind of ensure is that we have our operational costs covered. Now, we've got a very small economy. We've got a very small capitalist economy, I should say, as there is a lot of background production. At the moment, our guild-based off-map economy, if you like, is actually bigger than our kind of conventional capitalist economy. This is still an early modern economy that we have. The good side, the good part of that, is it means that our kind of operating costs for our economy are very small. We only have a couple of kind of modern capitalist factories. Unsurprisingly, a furniture factory in Constantinople, one manufactured goods shop, all of which produce at a very low level of kind of efficiency at this time, because there are no railroads. This area is still quite undeveloped in a lot of ways. So even though they're modern capitalist manufactories, they're not producing very much. And we have the ability here also to convert canned goods into manufactured goods, which is quite interesting. That is pretty much the extent of our capitalist economy. We're looking at kind of 3 factories, I think. That's pretty much it, and a handful of kind of agricultural enterprises dotted around the map. This area, the reason we want to kind of focus on a really small area is because this area is easily defensible. It's really unlikely that Russia's ever going to penetrate deep enough into Anatolia to threaten the kind of developed part of Western Anatolia. And it's fairly far removed from Europe as well, and we have the Bosporus ensuring that no one's going to cross over into Anatolia. So if this area is developed, fortified, really well defended, this is kind of, in a sense, you could say that the Ottoman Empire in some ways is sort of only about the size of Belgium to begin with, as a capitalist economy. Our capitalist economy begins here, this area here, and will become to include Thessalonica, Ankara, and Sinop as well. And we'll begin to kind of expand. But we want to focus on our economic development on a particular region to begin with. I think as an introduction, that's it. The name of the game is survival, prolonging the empire and buying ourselves enough time using everything at our disposal, diplomacy, to try and ensure a period of fairly sustained economic development. We've got a lot of catching up to do. We have a little bit of state revenue. We're going to, at some point, going to have to kind of check our tax sliders as well to ensure that we don't. So we're going to up our tariff tax a little bit, I think, probably to minimise kind of foreign penetration of our economy, if you like, the penetration of foreign goods. And early on, we are going to need state revenue. I think that's all for now. That's the introduction, anyway, to the grand campaign. Most videos are not going to be this long. It's just long, but I guess because it's the sort of first video, and I wanted to give a bit more of an appraisal of the faction and a bit more of an introduction to the game mechanics as well. The next video, I think, will be about, I'll start off with quarterly kind of videos. So the next video is going to be, I guess, March or April 1815, and we'll do another one in June, another one in September. And we'll kind of see how that works out, and we'll just provide an update in terms of what's happened over the previous months. If anything particularly special happens, any kind of crisis happens, then obviously it's turn-based, so it's not something that we're going to miss. It's something that I can instantly kind of like capture that and talk a bit about that as it happens. But we'll leave it there, and hope you enjoyed this introduction to the grand campaign. January 1850, it begins here.